Today's daf is daf Tzadi Gimel. Yesterday we finished daf Tzadi Beis with the machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes about the question of Haya B'derech Rechoka, whether or not the person who's far away can send a shliach and the carbon will be brought on his behalf. Rav Nachman said yes, and Rav Sheshes said no. And Rav Sheshes brought a proof from the Brisa of Rabbi Akiva, in which Rabbi Akiva equates derech rechoka with a tameh. And just like in the case of a tameh, b'mitzius, he could have someone else bring the carbon on his behalf, but eno osa, the Torah says he's not allowed to bring the carbon on Rishon, he has to bring it on Sheni. So to derech rechoka nami, even though it's physically possible for him to bring the carbon through a shliach, he's too far away, but eno osa, he's mufka, and he is sent off waiting till Pesach Sheni. So we're going to begin here on the third line down from Tzadi Gimel Amud Aleph, where we left off yesterday. Rav Nachman Omer Lecha, Rav Nachman's going to reject the proof from Rabbi Akiva that we don't shech the carbon on behalf of someone who's b'derech rechoka, Rabbi Akiva Tameh, because although it's a nice proof from Rabbi Akiva, but that's because Rabbi Akiva is being consistent. And this halacha that no one will bring the carbon on behalf of a Mishaya B'derech Rechoka is consistent with Rabbi Akiva's shita. The Kasavar ain't shochtim v'zarkin al Tmei Sheretz. In the case of a Tmei Sheretz, who is only Tomei that one day, he goes to mikvah on that same day, he needs Harif Shemesh. And if he became a Tmei Sheretz on the 14th of Nisan, then you and I would have said logically, let's bring the carbon on his behalf on the 14th, because he can eat the carbon Pesach after Hariv Shemesh at night. And yet Rabbi Akiva insists, no, we're not going to shech the carbon on his behalf. And even though he could eat the carbon Pesach at night, so that we see here that Rabbi Akiva holds that even in the case of Tameh, Shesipek B'Yod, there is a possibility for him to be makriv the carbon Pesach through the proxy, through the shliach, and nevertheless, and he'll be able to eat the carbon at night. Nevertheless, Rabbi Akiva holds that the Torah rejected a Tameh completely. And Rabbi Akiva took a step further, and by equation, the Torah equates Tameh Nefesh with Haya B'derech Rechoka. In both cases, a carbon cannot be brought on his behalf, even though b'mitzius there could be akrav on his behalf, and he will be able to eat the carbon Pesach at night. Nevertheless, he's mufka. But anan svirlan kiman diyomar sholtim v'zarken al tmei sheref. We disagree with Rabbi Akiva. We are of the opinion that others can be makriv a carbon on behalf of someone who's a tmei sheretz. And the reason, the logic behind it is that in the evening he'll be able to eat from the carbon Pesach together with everyone else because of Harev Shemesh. And if that be the case, this whole equation to say that Haya B'derech Rechoka should not have the ability to send a shliach, that's not true. Because Haya B'derech Rechoka brought down in the Torah together with Tamei Mes is Makrivin, we can be Shochet and Zorik the carbon on his behalf, both in the case of a Tameh, if he'll be able to eat the carbon Pesach at night, like the case of Tmei Sheretz, and in the case of Haya B'derech Rechoka. So we're up to Tana Rabbana. Let's see if we can find the place. It's on Daf Tzadi Gimel. We're talking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down from the top. Tana Rabbana. We learned in the Brisa. Elu sha'osim es hasheni. The Brisa lists a number of people who are delayed from Pesach Rishon because of reasons of Tumah, but they will bring Pesach Sheni. Hazovim v'azovos v'hamitzoroim v'hamitzoros v'nidos ubole nidos v'hayoldos. None of the above can bring the carbon Pesach Rishon because of their state of Tumah. And these on the list have what's called a Tumah Arucha. Arucha means a long extended Tumah, as opposed to a Tumah of one day. And therefore, they cannot be Tovil on that day and eat the Korban Pesach at night because that Tumah extends beyond that day. It doesn't terminate with the 14th of Nisan. Now the Brisa lists another group of people who are also pushed off to Pesach Sheni. Hashogigim, Vanusim, Vehamizidim, Vitame. Tame means tame mes, and Shahaya B'derech Rechoka. And if someone is a shogeg, he didn't know that today was the 14th, it's time to bring the Pesach. If he was an onus, he was locked up in a jail somewhere, he couldn't possibly bring the Korban Pesach. Or if he was mazed, he delivered in all these cases, including the case of a Tamei Mes, he will be postponed until Pesach Sheni. Imkain, now the Gemara asks, or I should say the Brisa itself asks the question, Lama Nemar Tamei. If even the case of Shogeg or Onus or Mazid is pushed off to Pesach Sheni, why did the Torah feel a necessity to mention Tomei? Tomei is explicit in the Pasuk, and the Torah says that if he's Tomei Nefesh, he has to bring Pesach Sheni. I mean, the Brisa has so many different cases where he cannot bring Pesach Rishon. Why does the Torah feel compelled to add Tomei? Now, before we get to the end of this Brisa, the Gemara takes a little bit of a digression. And the Gemara wants to know what was the question of the Brisa. Let's try to understand before we get to the end and the answer of the Brisa. What was the question? What was bothering the Brisa? Lama Nemar. Tamei. Are you asking why the Torah had to say Tamei? There's a great chiddush in Tamei. The iboy lemevad b'rishon lo shavkinale. Even if he could send the shliach to bring the carbon for Pesach Rishon, although he's Tamei, but the shliach will bring the carbon, is nevertheless, the Torah wants to be mechadish that he's pushed off to Pesach Sheni. And that's not true for the case of Hanusim. Hanusim means that anybody could bring the Korban Pesach on his behalf. There's no reason not to. In the case of Tamei, the Torah is being mechadish an amazing chiddush that despite the fact that somebody else who's tar would and could bring the Korban Pesach on his behalf, the Torah excludes him and sends him packing to Pesach Sheni. And that's not something that we would derive from an onus, because in the case of an onus, clearly somebody could bring the carbon on his behalf. Ella. So now the Gemara rewrites the question of the Brisa. What was the kasha that the Brisa was asking? Imkain lama nemar b'derech rechoka. What the Brisa was bothered by is, why did the Torah have to specify that a derech rechoka person, he's far away, he's pushed off to Pesach Sheni? The Torah didn't mention other anusim, somebody who's in a jail and he's incarcerated. Well, why do you mention derech rechoka? And we get to the Gemara's answer, the Brisa's answer, and that is that the reason why the Torah had to specify derech rechoka is lefotro min hakares, to teach us that even though he could have organized and engineered it such that he wouldn't be the derech rechoka, and he failed to do so, nevertheless he's not considered chayiv kares. The Torah is machadish a new category called derech rechoka to tell you that even though he wasn't as careful as he should have been, he's not chayiv kares. So now the Gemara wants to use this Brisa and be medayik to prove Rav Nachman. Ukemandi Omar Hurza. From the fact that the Brisa asks this kasha, why does it say derech rechoka? The Gemara, the Brisa could have given the same answer that it gave for Tamei. That the chiddush of Tamei is that the Tamei is mufka, he's sent off packing to Pesach Sheni, even though somebody else could bring the carbon on his behalf. And according to Rav Sheshes, that's exactly true in the case of derech rechoka. The Torah was machadish derech rechoka and compares it to Tamei. And in both cases, despite the fact that the Mitzvah, somebody could bring the carbon on his behalf, he's mufka, he's sent off to Pesach Sheni. From the fact that the Brisa looked and searched for a different answer to the question to justify why the Torah had to spell out derech rechoka, answering to tell you that he's parted from kares, apparently this Brisa reflects the shita of Nachman, that as far as derech rechoka is concerned, it's no different than onus, and somebody else could bring the carbon pesach on his behalf. Now it's interesting that the Brisa that we just learned in the list of people who are sent off to Pesach Sheni and the Tmeim mentions nidos and yoldos, and that means we're talking about a woman, obviously. And we're going to tell this woman who's Tmeah during Pesach Rishon that she should bring Pesach Sheni. So Gemara Sakashi here, Isha b'sheni mim chayva. I'm going to quote to you a brisa that's going to prove that a woman has the option of she's included in the parsha Pesach Rishon, but in events she cannot bring Pesach Rishon. We don't expect her; she's not included in the parsha of Pesach Sheni. For Tanya, we have a brisa. Yochol lo yu osin es Sheni el tmei nefesh b'sha hoya b'derech rechoka. I might think that the entire episode, the enterprise of Pesach Sheni, was created only for these two categories that are explicitly mentioned in the Torah Tmei Mes. And B'derech Rechoka, those are explicit in the pasuk in Parshas Balotzcha. Zavinu mitzorayim ubale nidos minayin. How do we know these cases of Tmeim that they too, even though it's not a Tmei Mes, they are postponed and they will bring Pesach Sheni? Tamid Lomar, each in Pesach Sheni it says each kiyeh tamei lenefesh. The Torah could have said, instead of Kiyah Tamei L'Nefesh, it could have just simply said, Ish Kiyiga B'mes. What was this term, Tamei Nefesh? And the word Tamei, it's mashma all Tameim. Otherwise, if it was only Tamei Mes, it should have said, Asher Yiga B'mes. Tamei is a generic term that encompasses all Tameim. Now, the Brisa doesn't mention that Zovos and Yoldos are pushed off to Pesach Sheni. It mentions Zovin u'mitzoron u'bole nidos. These are all men who are pushed off to Pesach Sheni by virtue of their tumah. And in the case of an Isha, for example, a Zava or Yoledes, the Brisa completely ignored omitted them from the list of those who bring Pesach Sheni. So we see that this brisa certainly holds that women don't have the requirement of Pesach Sheni. They're not included in the parsha. It says each to exclude women. But yet, earlier we quoted a brisa that had mentioned nidos and zavos and mitzoros, and they are all pushed off to Pesach Sheni. How do we reconcile these two brisas? Lo kasha. Harab Yosi, Harab Yehuda Rab Shimon. Yesterday, or actually it was at the end of 2 days ago, on Daf Sadi Aleph, we had a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi on the one hand, who includes women in Pesach Sheni, and the first price that we had here would reflect his shita, as opposed to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. They hold that a woman is not included in Pesach Sheni, and that would be reflected here in the second brisa. Now the Gemara is going to quote a brisa with a machlokas tanoim about the chiyuv kares in a person who did not bring Pesach Rishon b'mezid, and what happens if he would have brought Pesach Sheni? Would he be exempt from kares as a result of the fact that he brought Pesach Sheni? Or, for example, let's say he wanted to bring Pesach Sheni, but he was shogig in Pesach Sheni. Or maybe even if he brought the Pesach Sheni, since he was mezid in Pesach Rishon, he's chayav kares, and sof pasuk. That's the end of the story. Or, for example, we're going to have a case here of someone who was shogeg on Pesach Rishon, and when he got the opportunity to bring Pesach Sheni, he decided deliberately, b'mezid, that he doesn't want to bring Pesach Sheni as chayav kares. Toner Rabbanon. The Brisa is going to quote a threefold machlokas tanoim on these issues that we mentioned earlier. The first shita is the shita of Rebbe. And Rebbe says that if he was mezid on Pesach Rishon, chayav kares al Rishon, even if he was a shogeg as far as Pesach Sheni is concerned. Now, let's say he did not bring Pesach Sheni b'mezid. Chayav kares al Sheni, even though on the Rishon he was a shogeg. So it means the following: according to Rebbe, you'll be chayav kares both vis-a-vis Pesach Rishon and vis-a-vis Pesach Sheni. If you were mezid on Pesach Rishon, you're chayav kares. If you were shogeg or honest on Pesach Rishon, but you were mezid on Pesach Sheni, you're chayav kares. Divrei Rebbe. Rabbi Nosson Omer, if he didn't bring the Pesach Rishon b'mezid chayav kares al Rishon. and it makes no difference whether he brought Pesach Sheni or he didn't bring Pesach Sheni. And that means that Pesach Rishon is independent of Pesach Sheni, or say it the other way around, Pesach Sheni is independent of Pesach Rishon, and he's Chayiv Koris al Rishon. Upoter al Sheni. What if he was Mazin on the Sheni? And let's say he was Shoging on the Rishon, he's Potter. There's no Koris on the Sheni. So here's the machlok between Rebbe and Rebbe Nosson. Whereas Rebbe holds your Chayiv Koris for a Mazin al Pesach Sheni, even though you were Shoging on Pesach Rishon. Rebbe Nosson says that there's no Chayiv Koris for Pesach Sheni, and Pesach Rishon is independent. It has its own Chayiv Koris in event that you were Mazin on Pesach Rishon. Now we have the third sheet. Rav Chananya ben Akav Omer, Af al harishon eino chayv koris elam kein lo asa es hasheni. In other words, Rabbi Chananya holds that in order to be chayv koris, you have to be mazed on both Pesach Rishon or on Pesach Sheni. If you were shogig or honest on one of the two, you're exempt from koris. V'ozdu l'tamayim. And this machlokes between Rebbe and Rebbe Nosson, that's what we're focused on now, is lishitasam. It is very consistent with another machlokas that they have as to whether or not Pesach Sheni is independent of Pesach Rishon. You remember that Rabbi Nosson holds Pesach Sheni is independent, whereas Rebbe sees an interrelationship, an interdependence, because according to Rebbe, Chayiv Koris al Rishon and Chayiv Koris al Sheni, which means that if he was shogig in one of the two, but Mazin in the other, he will be Chayiv Koris. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa Gerchen, it's got ben Shtei Pesachim l'kein cotton shehigdom ben Shtei Pesachim. So you have someone who's not included in Pesach Rishon because he was a guy at that time, or he was a katan at that time, but he's included in Pesach Sheni. And Rebbe says Chayav Lasos Pesach Sheni. In other words, according to Rebbe, and Rebbe, if you remember, held that in Pesach Sheni, if he did not bring Pesach Rishon, Pesach Sheni now steps into the feet, into the shoes, so to speak, of Pesach Rishon. And Pesach Sheni now will generate a Chiyuv Kares, even if he was shoging on Pesach Rishon. So we see that Pesach Sheni is an entity that replaces Pesach Rishon to such an extent that now it would generate its own Kares, and it would generate its own Chiyuv Karban, meaning Pesach, in event that he wasn't included in Pesach Rishon, like the Ger and the Katan. Rabbi Nosson Omer, Kol shezakuk l'rishon, zakuk l'sheni, Kol sheni zakuk l'rishon, ein zakuk l'sheni. In other words, according to Rabbi Nosson, Pesach Sheni is an opportunity, a second chance for Pesach Rishon. But if you were never included Pesach Rishon, then there's no Pesach Sheni. V'maikam miflagi. What is the fundamental principle here about which we have a machlokes tanoim? Rebbe holds Sheni regel b'fnei atzmahu. According to Rebbe, there's a separate chiyuv korban Pesach that's inherent in Pesach Sheni, and therefore, even if he wasn't chayiv in Pesach Rishon, he's chayiv in Pesach Sheni, like the cases of the ger and the katan. B, what it means is that even if he was shogig or honest on Pesach Rishon, if he was mazin on Pesach Sheni, he is chayiv kares. Rabbi Nosson Sover Sheni Tashlumen the Rishonhu. Sheni is not a new entity that completely replaces Pesach Rishon. It's nothing more than the Torah giving you an opportunity to be Makayiv the mitzvah of Korban Pesach in event that you were Chayiv in Pesach Rishon, but you weren't able to fulfill that Chiyuv. And the Torah is going to say that we're going to give you another option to replace the first option, because the first Pesach you were a katan, you were a guy, so it wasn't shayach. So in that case, you're not chayav Pesach Sheni. But if you are included in Pesach Rishon, and for whatever reason you didn't fulfill that chiyuv, then we give you tashlum. We give you an option of Pesach Sheni. That's called tashlumin de Rishon. So therefore, if you weren't chayav on the first, like the case of the ger and the katan, then you don't need to bring Pesach Sheni, because Pesach Sheni is only Tashlumin for Rishon, an event that you were Chayiv. So now we have Pesach Sheni not as a chova unto itself according to Rabbi Nosson, but rather Tashlumin l'Rishon. And in the case where he's a shogeg in Rishon, we're going to allow him to bring a Pesach Sheni. Tikune l'Rishon lo metaknina le. But if, let's say, he was chayiv karetz as a result of being mazid in Pesach Rishon, then although he has an option of bringing Pesach Sheni, it's not going to be metaken. It's not a tikkun for the chayiv karetz that he incurred by virtue of the mazid the Pesach Rishon. Now we get to the third sheet of the Tanoim. Rabbi Hanani ben Akavya Savar, that you're only chayiv karetz in an event that you were mazid in both Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Sheni takanta de Rishonu, the Pesach Sheni is meant to be a takana tikkun to fix up the chiyuv kares of Pesach Rishon, and therefore, if he was mazid the Pesach Rishon, then we're going to have to ask what happened with Pesach Sheni. If he brought Pesach Sheni, that removes the chiyuv kares from Pesach Rishon, and if he wanted to bring the Pesach Sheni, but he was shogeg and circumstance was such that he could not fulfill it, then he's not going to be chayiv kares for Pesach Rishon, because the chiyuv kares, according to Reb Chananya ben Akavya, is the combination of A plus B. We integrate both Pesach Rishon, Pesach Sheni. If he was mazid in both, then and only then is he chayiv kares. So shloshtan mikra echad darshu. The Gemara says all three shitas tanoim have a different interpretation of one particular pasuk in the parsha in Ba'alotzcha of Pesach Sheni. The Torah says, "V'ha'ish asher hu tahar, u'b'derech lo haya, v'chadal la'sos ha'pesach, v'nichrasa nefesh hahi me'ameh ki karban Hashem lo hikriv b'moado." And then it says, "Chet o yisa ha'ish hahu." Now, what's interesting about this pasuk is that it opens up with a person who was chadal la'sos ha'pesach, and he gets kares. And then at the end of the pasuk it says, he, etc., lo hikriv b'moado, cheto yisa, etc. Lo hikriv b'moado is a repeat of the description in the reish of the pasuk of chadal la'sos ha'pesach. So Rebbe Yisrael v'chadal la'sos ha'pesach v'nichrasa d'lo aviv b'rishon. So if he deliberately did not bring Pesach Rishon, he is described in the reish of the pasuk as chadal la'sos ha'pesach. And then inami, the Torah says that there's another possible way that you could incur a chiyuv kares, and that's the end of the pasuk. You read it almost like a pasuk unto itself. Karban Hashem lo hikriv b'moado. It's referring to Pesach Sheni. So whereas the beginning of the pasuk clearly is referring to Pesach Rishon, and he incurs a chiyuv kares, the second part of the pasuk is addressing Pesach Sheni as an independent entity, and if he was mazed on Pesach Sheni, which in the language of the Torah is Karban Hashem lo hikriv b'moado, is b'sheni, therefore he is chayiv kares for the Sheni. So the Gemara says, where does it say that he's chayiv kares in Pesach Sheni? It just says, ki Karban Hashem lo hikriv b'moado. The answer is the end of the pasuk. Cheto yisa ha'ishahu. Rebbe is going to interpret that cheto yisa ha'ishahu is a reference to a chiyuv kares. And the Gemara now is going to ask, how do you know such thing? How did Rebbe know such a thing?